So yeah, when Ratnaguna, Artavardin, Maharshada Sangadara and myself started to meet a few months ago to discuss the men's situation in Manchester, out of which these sessions have emerged, we all spoke of wanting to explore a strong teaching with you all, a challenging teaching. We wanted to create a dynamic conversation amongst us about Dharma practice and stimulate questions, even disagreements. But as the sessions have gone on, as we've delved deeper into this teaching of the true individual, I've personally had a much deeper sense of how challenging a teaching it is. And I felt humbled by it, actually. And I felt the challenge to my own practice of the teaching. And as Ratnaguna has been saying, of course, the teaching of the true individual is a high ideal. Sangharakshita equates the true individual to a stream entrance. So we're talking about someone who's made some decisive shifts deep down in their being. As Ratnaguna was saying in his introduction, a true individual is deeply mindful, deeply aware of their own conditioning and the effect that they have on others and the world around them. They're even aware of the fundamental nature of life, its fleeting, transitory nature. And they're friendly and generous and kind and have a deep sense of compassion, sensitivity and understanding of others. They rejoice in what is good in human beings. But they're not disturbed when life doesn't go as expected. They're creative. They spontaneously respond skillfully to what life brings their way. And they've absorbed the truth of the Dharma on deeper levels, and they can see the complex web of conditions that manifest in the world around them. And they stand grounded in the truth, in this perspective on life. And in this respect, they're willing to stand alone, even if others don't agree with them, because they have a deep confidence in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and they've committed themselves to the path. But they don't want to keep all that to themselves. They don't want to keep the teachings and the practices to themselves. But they've got a strong urge to help and encourage others too. So at times, this can feel very far away from me. Looking at this teaching again, I've been reminded how negative and critical I can feel, how unmindful I can be, how difficult it is for me to stand confidently in what I'm doing. And I've had this strong sense of this tension that I feel between my habits, my own conditioning, and my aspiration to be more loving and more skillful. And Sangharakshita's teaching challenges me on many levels in this respect. Now, I say this with some tenderness towards myself. I don't feel I'm being harshly self-critical, although I know I can do that. It's rather that I feel like I'm just trying to take a gentle, honest look at myself. I think I can feel, I don't know whether you sort of resonate with this, but I can feel so tired of my habits, so tired of how I polarize or how my fears stop me from acting from a more expansive, more loving perspective. And I have had glimpses of something more expansive, and I've sensed the liberation that lies within that. So I also feel this pull to want to take my own practice deeper. Thankfully, I don't feel alone in that. I was struck in the first talk that Ratnaguna gave in this series, just saying how difficult it is to be a true individual, and that he's been trying to become a true individual for 40 odd years of practice, and it's difficult. And I think that Sangharakshita knew how difficult it was too. I think he knew some of those tensions for himself. In What is the Sangha? Sangharakshita says, leading the spiritual life is very difficult. Being a Buddhist, a real Buddhist, is very difficult. We need help. And I think he's talking from his own experience. I think he knew in his own way how difficult it is to be a Buddhist. Again and again, Sangharakshita was up against it. During his time in India, he was very much on his own, without a Sangha around him in the way that we have. And he had to dig deep into his own resources to establish his own practice and his life as a Buddhist. And then when he returned to Britain in the 1960s and set up what we now call the Triratna Buddhist community, He encountered a lot of criticism, particularly people questioning his authority and legitimacy to set up a new Buddhist movement and order. So he knew very well what it's like to stand apart from the crowd. And significantly, I think, after his experience of being very much on his own in India, he knew the importance of Sangha, and he dedicated most of his adult life to the task of establishing an effective and true spiritual community. But he also knew how difficult it is to establish that. He knew very well how difficult that is. I think it's significant that we find the main teaching of the true individual in the book, What is the Sangha? And I think it's really important to try and understand this more deeply, because I think Sangharakshita deeply knew that to become a true individual, most of us will need others to find others to practice with. We'll need to find a community to practice within. At the heart of What is the Sangha, he fundamentally describes the process of becoming a true individual in relationship to others. And in doing so, the movement we can make from what he calls the group, which is, I think, is basically all the conditioning that we've built up over the years, to then finding a positive group, finding others who will help and encourage us to grow and develop. And then as our practice together deepens, the potential for a spiritual community to come into being. And in this talk, I want to explore in more detail this movement and dynamic process from group to spiritual community, but also some of the tensions that are inherent in this movement. But then ultimately how that tension can break and liberate us. So to become a true individual, Sangharakshita says we need to break free from the group. But what does he mean by the group? So as examples in What's the Sangha, he mentions family, school, work, political parties, our class, economic, social and racial groups. But essentially, I think what he's talking about is the life experiences, the views and habits that condition us. So we're all part of various groupings that have their own values, rules, and their own ways of being in the world. Sangharakshita says our ideas, our views, our feelings, the way we react to people and situations, our convictions, all these tend to be determined by group conditioning of one kind or another. And the groups themselves often overlap or even cohere. And all these overlapping groups together make up the world. So I don't think he's saying that groups are bad. I think he's just saying that it's what we do as human beings. We naturally form groups to survive. All of us are seeking a sense of belonging, security in the groups that we've grown up in or that we're part of now as adults. But those groups affect us, often quite unconsciously. The values and views that we absorb from those groups get acted out in our day-to-day lives. It's as if he's saying, that we need to be aware of what we bring to our spiritual lives and to the community that we practice within. So personally, I've brought a whole complex web of conditioning with me to both my practice and to the Sangha. My working class roots really shaped me and my views about my place in the world. So I had this feeling that on some level, my family didn't have the same opportunities of the other people that I saw around me. And I saw my parents struggling sometimes to make ends meet. I saw my father's perennial fear of redundancy, my mother's desire to have material things that she felt would make life better for us as a family, but the struggles that she sometimes had to be able to do that. Then as I got older, I also felt tensions about being part of that group, about the limitations of the life that I'd grown up in. So I felt these pulls into other groups. So my identity as a working class man and my sense of belonging was painfully challenged when I went to university and left the family home. I entered this more middle class world of university, and that was quite difficult for me. But also I felt as a young gay man at the time, really motivated to escape the narrow-minded working class culture of the town that I'd grown up in. So moving to a city for me opened up new opportunities to break free of that conditioning in some way, to break free of my fears of rejection and that sense of restriction. But it meant that I joined a gay culture for a while, with quite a heavy emphasis on clubbing, drinking, casual sex. And then a few years later, I think, again, from my working class roots and probably quite a strong sense of anger about the inequalities in the world, I got involved in politics and social work, which led me into many other groups, political groups and workplace groups. So these are just some of the ways that I've been conditioned in my life, and they've shaped who I am. And there are many others. And I'm not saying that these groups haven't been important to me, or that they haven't helped me to grow and develop. I think they have. But I also know that underneath that conditioning is quite a deep-seated, subtle sense of us and them. And I think this is the real issue at play, this subtle sense of us and them that arises from this conditioning. Sangharakshita says, the group consists of people who relate to one another in terms of power. Power is the principle that governs their relationships. And I think that power is often subtle rather than overt. It's unconscious rather than conscious. And it may play out in our trying to exert ourselves and feel more powerful than others in some way. I think the political activism that I was involved in was inherently about that. Or it may play out, as it has done for me often, more in a sense of powerlessness, that they are different to me or they're threatening me in some way. And it means that I can be quite defended, that I armour myself against what feels threatening, or I find someone else to blame for my pain and hurt feelings. But either way, whether it's about trying to exert power or feeling powerlessness, I think it's essentially about power. And again, I say this with some tenderness towards myself. I'm not a bad person for having this conditioning. I can't help it. It's just how I am. It's what my life has given me. And again, I think it's best that that I'm just as honest as I can be, and know more clearly the material that I'm trying to work with. I'm working with this tension between my conditioning and then my aspiration to be more skillful has become one of the most important areas of my practice, trying to see more clearly what triggers me and causes me to react unskillfully. And personally, when I first came to the Buddhist Centre, first came along, I remember feeling exhausted with some of this conditioning. I felt so exhausted with being so angry at the world all the time and tired of the arguments and difficulties that I was having with friends and family. Sangharakshita says that this sense of dissatisfaction with ourselves and our lives is a positive and powerful impulse. And I wonder if many of us first come to a Buddhist centre with this sense of dissatisfaction, this instinctive sense of the problems that our conditioning creates for us, how it can hold us back from something more positive in our lives. So with that sense of wanting to change in some way, we come to a Buddhist centre. And Sangharakshita says that the role of a Buddhist centre is to help us make changes in our lives, if that's what we want to do. He says a Buddhist centre is the bridge, it's the common ground where these two worlds meet and overlap. So we come to this Buddhist movement, and that, it could be called a Buddhist group. And Sangharakshita calls this the positive group, a group that encourages us to grow, and where there is that possibility of becoming a true individual. However, Sangharakshita prefers to call it a Buddhist movement. And he's very particular about the use of the word movement because he says that suggests a dynamic process. And I think the use of these terms, bridge and movement, describe what we encounter. And I think they're quite interesting because to me it suggests that maybe this change that we enter into a Buddhist centre desiring can happen. When that can happen, it has both like an outer and inner manifestation. So the outer movement is the bridge, and I like this image of a Buddhist centre as a bridge. You can imagine people moving across it. Some people know where they're going and are walking quite purposefully over the bridge. Others are ambling. Some have maps, and some just rely on their instinct to get to their destination. You may bump into others on the bridge. You may be walking so unmindfully that you knock other people over. Some are coming in the opposite direction to us, so you have to get out of their way. And some are just stood on the side of the bridge looking out at the view. And some are even on the wrong bridge and have to get off and keep crossing it to try and see if it is the right bridge. Whatever is happening, it's full of movement. And the inner aspect is maybe the movement. It's the movement within us, the tectonic plates of our being shifting around. And I looked in the dictionary at the definition of movement, which opens it out more fully. So movement is the act or an instant of changing position. It's journeying, voyaging, evolving, stirring. It's a progression. It's a passage. It's flux. It's an advance and regression. It's a relocation, migration. It can also mean squirming, twitching, wriggling. I think these last words might be quite apt for our descriptions of what it can be like to be in a Sangha sometimes. But I think these terms, bridge and movement, help us to understand more fully that this Buddhist movement, this Buddhist centre, and ourselves within it are constantly in process. The inner and outer movements of change are happening all the time as we walk on the bridge together. And I think part of our practice as a Sangha is to try and be as aware as we can of where each of us might be in that process. So we all know the different elements of a Buddhist centre that can encourage us to change. You know, the introductory classes and courses, the Sangha nights that we come to, the pujas and festivals that we attend, how we volunteer to help out at the centre, the study groups we join, the retreats we go on. Through all these things, we get to know other people in the Sangha better, and our friendships start to form. I guess this is a familiar story for all of us here. You know, we'll all have been in that process of getting involved in those things and taking those things more deeply. And I think these are all very important things. They help to establish ourselves in the Sangha, and after a while, coming to the centre becomes an important part of our lives alongside the other things that we do. And for some of us, this will be enough. Not everyone who comes to a Buddhist centre will want to commit themselves more deeply. In fact, it will only be comparatively few who do so. And that's fine. People can be part of our Sangha in many, many different ways. We just need to be clear about what we're doing. But for those of us who do want to take things deeper, Sangha actually holds out a challenge to us. And in What's the Sangha, he refers to the opening of the London Buddhist Centre in the 1970s, and he says, did we work so hard so that we could do a little therapeutic meditation and take a medicinal dose of Buddhism once in a while, just so that we could keep going with our normal life in the same old way? And he also warns us that, liking the positive atmosphere of the Buddhist Centre, we may want to join this community, but we are joining it not as a spiritual community to develop spiritually, but for the sake of warmth and companionship. And if we're honest, that will be at play for us. You know, change is difficult and our habits and attachments are strong. Intellectually, we may want to commit ourselves and change, but emotionally, it's much harder than that. Making a deeper change is a whole journey in itself. It may take years for us to realise that we want to commit ourselves, or other things in our lives may take precedence or just stop us from committing. And if we do commit, we don't know where that journey will take us. We don't know what may open up for us. It may be straightforward, but it may take us in many different directions. We just don't know. And because it is difficult and not straightforward, we'll often feel this tension of wanting to change, but we'll also feel the pull of just wanting the reassurance and the comfort and safety of the groups that we're part of, including the Buddhist group that we've found. But if we can stay with it, we may glimpse something else, something different. What can begin to emerge as another level of contact with people at the centre, a deeper level of friendship. And for me, as I started to make deeper commitments, one of the things that I experienced is that those who are more experienced than me started to move towards me and offered to walk beside me on the path. And slowly, through these friendships, I felt my ways of relating to others starting to change, my defences slowly dropping. So it's through these deeper friendships that I've seen glimpses of a true spiritual community. But what do we mean by a spiritual community? Interestingly, Sangharakshita says in What is the Sangha? The spiritual community is not a collectivity of any kind. It's a community of individuals. It's not even a substitute for a group. I was really struck by that, and I kept wondering what it was that he meant. I know that in my own sort of involvement in the Sangha, I often use the word collective. I find myself saying, well, what's our collective response? Or we need to make a collective decision. But here's Sangharakshita saying that the spiritual community is not a collective at all. So what is the difference between the collective and a spiritual community? Again, I looked in the dictionary, and on the surface, collective and community look very similar. So collective or collectively is mutually, cooperatively, together. Community is commonality, a group of people sharing a common interest and relating together socially. Well, as I delved deeper, I think I started to get maybe nearer to what Sangharakshita meant. So if we look at the word collective in a more organisational or political sense, a collective is an organisation or business that is owned and controlled by the people who work in it. For example, a collective farm, or the organisation of all of a country's production and industry, so that it is owned and managed by the government. So I started to wonder, is collective therefore more inherently organisational or even more inherently political? Whereas with the term community, I wonder if we move more into what could be called religious territory, leading to terms such as communion or to commune. So communion is the sharing or exchanging of intimate thoughts and feelings, especially on a mental or spiritual level. Or to commune is to get very close to someone or something by exchanging feelings or thoughts. Or another definition, lying naked in the grass among the trees and birds, he felt he was communing with nature. So is community therefore inherently about communication and intimacy, inherently religious even? The most useful definition I found between the difference between collective and community was this. A collective is a one-way conversation where the opportunities to learn and grow are limited by a single goal. Whereas a community is a like-minded group of individuals that favours two-way communication as a way to increase their knowledge. Whereas a collective tries to change its participants into similarly styled members, a community preserves individuality to improve all. So I think it's this difference between a one-way conversation and two-way communication that I think begins to define the difference Sangharakshita is making between the collective and the community. In another text, in The Meaning of Conversion of Buddhism, Sangharakshita says that a spiritual community is not just about being together, but it's essentially a matter of communication, not merely an exchange of ideas and information. And he gives a working definition of the communication that can develop within a spiritual community. He says, what is communication? Well, it isn't very easy to say. A working definition might be a vital mutual responsiveness on the basis of a common ideal and a common principle. This is the communication in the context of going for refuge, a shared exploration of the spiritual world between people who are in a relationship of complete honesty and harmony. The communication is the exploration, And the exploration is the communication. In this way, spiritual progress takes place. It may not be clear how it happens, but happen it certainly does. And it's this aspect of friendship, this good, honest communication and staying in relationship to each other that I think gives us glimpses of what it means to be part of a true spiritual community. This communication, this vital mutual responsiveness, has many facets. We may experience it when we rejoice in each other. And when that rejoicing goes deep, we fundamentally witness something about the other, or we feel deeply seen ourselves. And I don't think we should underestimate the power of that. Well, that deep communication may be through our confession practice. Again, it can be really powerful when we open ourselves up to others and open up our ethical lives to others, with those that we trust. Through my own practice of confession, I know that I've slowly dropped some of those defenses that I talked about earlier, and I've worked more directly on that conditioning. I've become more known to myself. I know more clearly what makes me tick as a human being, even what the nature of being a human being really is. Well, that deeper communication may come through conflict. As we deepen our connections and get closer to each other, inevitably, the more likely it is that conflict may arise. Our buttons get pushed. We'll find that we disagree with others, and we may come into conflict with those that we thought were our friends, who are on the same wavelength as us. And that communication can even break down completely. That happens in our community. It's happened to me. I know that I've had times when I've really lost it with people in the Sangha. I've been in meetings where the communication has just broken down so much that people have walked out of the room. And sometimes those hurts and resentments are just too strong for us to resolve on our own. Sometimes we need some help from somebody else in the Sangha when the communication has broken down so much. And again, that's happened to me. I've been part of mediated meetings with other Sangha members where someone has just supported us to come into a more honest dialogue with each other and has helped us to face what's happened, and where we've been able to express what's been going on for us and what the impact of that has been on us. At their best, those meetings where those meetings of deep listening and healing can take place. Not always, but I have experienced that happening, where that deep listening and healing takes place. Often what I've glimpsed in those moments is a deep love and care for the other person underneath all my hurt and pain. And I felt that reciprocated too. There's been this extending out of beyond our self-protection and our defences. A courage to go beyond ourselves and the distinctions between us just dissolving for a moment. In what's the Sangha actually says, if the principle that governs the group is power, then the principle embodied in the spiritual community is love. And in the 10 Pillars of Buddhism, he says it's a love that is no mere flabby sentiment, but the vigorous expression of an imaginative identification with other living beings, a cherishing, protecting, maturing love. And what I've glimpsed in those moments is a deeper, more embodied, imaginative connection with those I've been in conflict with, seeing no real distinction between myself and them. For a moment, I've just been able to see the suffering at play, and that it's not my suffering or their suffering, it's just suffering. Of course, it's really easy for me to say all this, but it's much harder to do in practice. And when things go wrong in our community, it's really painful. And the tension between our ideals and the realities of our experience can be really difficult to hold. We know this only too well in Triratna. I know this only too well personally. But if we can keep those ideals alive while keeping our feet firmly on the ground, we might get a glimpse of the real potential of a spiritual community. In that glimpse of a solidarity with other living beings beyond our blood ties, beyond our own identities, we see what ideally lies at the heart of the spiritual community, the bodhicitta. Sangharakshita says that the bodhicitta is the myth that inspires the Buddhist spiritual community. But what is the bodhicitta? Well, that's another talk in itself, but put simply, you could say it's the heart's wish for enlightenment, not just for ourselves, but for all beings, where we see the sufferings of others so deeply, so profoundly, that we want to help them to become free. You could say that the bodhicitta is the seed of the metabhavana fully grown. It's our well-wishing for all beings at its deepest. Again, in the meaning of conversion, Sangharakshita says that the bodhicitta is the aspiration to enlightenment where there's not a shadow of selfhood. It cannot therefore be called mine. There's no question of keeping it to oneself. By definition, it has to be communicated. So how does this myth that inspires the spiritual community come about? How can we cultivate it? We're using a traditional teaching of cultivating the bodhicitta from the 5th century Indian master Vasubandhu. Sangharakshita says that there are 4 factors at play. Now, 2 of those factors involve reflecting on the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and reflecting on their qualities. And of course, we had a taste of that as a practice in the session that Ma Shraddha led last month. But Vasubandhu also says that we need to reflect on the true nature of conditioned existence and the suffering of others. Again, from the meaning of conversion, Sangharakshita says, the bodhicitta is said to arise as a result of the coalescence of 2 trends of experience, the trend of withdrawal and the trend of involvement in the world. The first of these trends represents renunciation in the extreme sense, a withdrawal from worldly activities, worldly thoughts, and secular associations. This withdrawal is aided by a reflection on the faults of conditioned existence. You reflect that life in this world, whirling round and round in the wheel of life, is profoundly unsatisfactory. You experience physical pain and discomfort. You don't get what you want. You're separated from people that you like. You have to do things that you don't want to do. All you want to do is to get away from the fluctuations, the vicissitudes and distractions of mundane life into the unchanging rest of nirvana. And I was struck when I was reading that you could say that that's the move away from the group towards individuality at its very deepest level. Sangharakshita goes on, the second trend in your experience, involvement, represents concern for living beings. You reflect it would be all right for me to opt out and withdraw from it all. I'd like that. But what about other people? What will happen to them? In the trend of withdrawal, you reflect on the sufferings and imperfections of conditioned existence only insofar as they affect you. But here, you reflect on them as they affect other living beings. You look around and reflect on their troubles and difficulties. Losing their jobs, marriages breaking up, bereavement. If you think it over, there is not a single person who is not suffering in some way. Even if they seem happy in the ordinary sense, there are still things they have to bear, separation or illness, old age, death. And of course, we only have to look at the last few months of the pandemic to see this quite clearly, to see that there's been illness and death, separation from loved ones, a deep existential sense of uncertainty and loss of control in our lives. Sangharakshita describes these 2 trends of withdrawal and involvement as another tension. He says, so there is a conflict if you're big enough and rich enough in your nature to embrace the possibilities of such a conflict. And the potentially shattering effects of this conflict can be seen in the myth and image of the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. This strange image speaks to us of seeing deeply the suffering of all humanity and of a profoundly compassionate response to that suffering. It speaks of a body breaking, shattering, a body being transformed. Avalokiteshvara vows to liberate all beings from suffering, and that if he ever wavered from that vow, that he would shatter into 1,000 pieces. After a while, though, he saw that he had only helped a tiny fraction of beings, and he felt a profound sorrow. And he thought, what's the use? I can do nothing for them. It's just better to be peaceful and happy just by myself. So feeling deeply broken, suddenly Avalokiteshvara's head and body shattered into 1,000 pieces. He cried out in agony to the Buddha Amitabha, who gently put his hand on Avalokiteshvara's shattered head and blessed him and transformed the pieces of his head into 10 faces, placing his own on top, and the torn flesh of Avalokiteshvara's body into 1,000 arms and hands to help all beings. And it's those arms and hands, those heads looking in all directions out at the world, that are the spiritual community at its highest and in its deepest potential. This is the image that Sangharakshita says is the symbol of our order, and he says that we should take that literally, not just as myth. Of course, it's easy to translate a beautiful story and image like this as some kind of unreachable utopia, which bears no relation to our own experience. Again, we need to keep our feet on the ground. But stories and myth do speak to us of more fundamental truths. The truth of breaking, of shattering our self-construct. For us, that will be the breaking down of our defences, the breaking down of our sense of us and them. And the truth also that we can't end suffering, ours or other people's, on our own. We need others. And it's in these truths that we may get a tiny glimpse of as we engage as fully as we can in our Sangha here in Manchester. Just like we glimpse our own potential to be a true individual, so we also may have a glimpse of the spiritual community as our experiences deepen with each other in the here and now. So I just want to end with some brief reflections on the situation we find ourselves in now. So I don't know about you, but when COVID first hit us and we went into complete lockdown, I found it an incredibly existential moment. Around the world, life as we knew it, all the things that we felt that we could rely on, suddenly changed. Everything broke down as we faced the stark reality of the pandemic. And for me, it did feel like a break-in. I can remember feeling at the beginning of the lockdown periods of grief almost that was, I don't know, difficult to make sense of. It was not like any grief that I'd experienced before. But for those moments, I was really struck by what seemed to really matter. A deep compassion for others that manifested in the tireless work of those caring for the sick and dying. But also this creative spirit that seemed to rise above the situation we faced. And a renewed sense of the importance of friendship and community. But I also had a sense that life after this could change for the worse. I feared that we could be heading for a great period of economic uncertainty and social unrest. And in those moments, I personally had a deep sense of the importance of the Dharma in my own life, a deep sense of how the Dharma could help others too. Now, obviously, this is very personal to me, but I wonder if you might have felt some of these things also. What about for us in the Sangha? Our Buddhist Centre was one of those things that we take for granted that suddenly disappeared as soon as we went into lockdown. And we too, as a Sangha, have found our own creative spirit. I think we've done a good job of keeping our community together during this time. And hopefully things will get back to some sort of normality soon. But I think it is fragile. Our community is fragile. And I don't think the year ahead of us is going to be an easy one. And of course, the world around us is fragile too. Who knows what sort of social situation we're heading into? It's obviously getting clearer and clearer, some of the economic difficulties that are ahead of us. And of course, with economic difficulties, there's that distinct possibility that it could lead to more social unrest, divisions becoming stronger between us, deeper levels of pain and suffering. And for some people, their response to that situation may be political, or it may be by helping with social issues. And there are many people who will be engaged in those responses, on those levels of political and social, responding socially and politically. And that'll include some of us. But we probably need to note that there are relatively few of us who have found the Dharma, and relatively fewer still who are trying to deeply practice the teachings. So if, like me, you have a deep sense of the importance of the Dharma, then maybe it would be helpful for us to ask ourselves some questions. So what is it that we want from our Sangha? Is it just warmth and comfort? Or do we want true spiritual change? What is it that we can offer our Sangha and to other people too? What are we willing to give? And what's the clarity about the Dharma that we need to help us to do this? So if we feel inspired to take our practice deeper, if we feel inspired by the ideal of the spiritual community that I've described, with all its ups and downs and all its challenges, and what do we need to do to help us to become more of a true individual? And what do we need to do to help us to create a true spiritual community, if that's what we really want? What is our next step? Thank you.